Hey, what's up, guys? Chad here with the Reptile Rangers. Now, we are at the Kernersville Reptile Zoo Medical Center and Store again today, and we're going to talk about a pretty commonly talked about topic, but one that seems to be a lot of controversy running around it. Just before we get into that, right in that bottom corner, right there, my fingers touching that right there, is our subscriber button. Make sure you hit that, and for those that have, we appreciate you following along week after week after week. Now, let's get right into this. All right, so today we're going to talk about, is humidity important or is it dangerous? Well, it's actually both. So there's a lot of controversy around the topic about humidity in enclosures. And we're going to talk as in-depthly as we can today, not fine-tuning it down. There's a lot of variables, okay? With every single pen, with every single enclosure, there's going to be variables. But what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and relate this down as best as we can to making your choice as to how you do humidity, how much or how little, and in what application is it best to add things like misters, foggers, spray bottles, whatever the case may be, backpack sprayer, pump sprayers, whatever. However you put moisture into your habitat, we're going to try and go over as much of that as we can today and at least give the goods, the bads, the indifference, and how it should be applied as best as possible. All right? So let's get started with this. Humidity. Humidity is very important for all of us, for everything in nature, for things like tissue and organs and other such stuff to not dry out. Think of in our nasal cavity, in our throat, in our mouths, in our eyes. Yes, we have moisture inside of our body, but that also helps to keep moisture going into our bodies in some aspect, as we do need a little bit of humidity. Now, naturally speaking, inside of a home, you're running 15 to 20% humidity in the first place because of things like tubs and toilets and sinks and so on and so forth. When we start talking about humidity in your reptile's habitat, let's start trying to break this down. Let's just use, for example, the animal behind me, broadband copperhead. Not many people's going to keep them in fully bioactive ecosystems. Guess what? You actually can, and it works. But you have to do this very, very carefully. In the wild, there's things called microclimates. There's going to be areas of wet and cooler. There's going to be areas of dry and hotter. So in the wild, these animals can go to or from whatever they want to do. A lot of the times in enclosed spaces, especially small spaces that most people will keep them in, and when I say small, we're talking relative, okay? Small is relative compared to the wild, okay? Now, when we start comparing the wild to captivity, that's just totally ambiguous because it's really hard to compare, and I'm a very big proponent of how does an animal live out in nature. Let's try and mimic that. But there's some parts of that that is relative, okay? We cannot mimic natural ecosystems to its perfection without us messing something up in enclosed spaces, because we have to remember humidity in the wild is totally different than humidity inside of an enclosure. And that's what people fail to remember. So taking this little guy right here, he has pockets of dry, he has pockets of sunlight, he has pockets of wet where the live plants are, and we don't hose the whole tank down, we only water the plants themselves. So he has microclimates, as they would have in the wild. Now, when we're talking about any species of animal, being able to create microclimates, as I said before, is very difficult in what we would classify as smaller enclosures. 40 breeders, 55 long, 75 gallons, even 150 and 250 gallon tanks are small by relative standards of the great outdoors, right? So how do you do appropriate amounts of humidity for certain species of animals? Well, first off, you need to know the species. Now, a lot of people, especially ball python forms, Lord have mercy, I think ball python forms and bearded dragon forms, of course, there's probably other ones, are probably the two worst places on Facebook to ever get yourself involved, because half of these people are absolute idiots that's trying to give information. And they're giving absolutely 100% incorrect information. They're giving what they think or what they've been told or what somebody else has said or what sounds, honestly, that's almost like just what sounded good to them in their head at the time. And some of the worst information that's ever out there given is in some of these specific Facebook forums. And it's kind of funny because you have a, ball python or a person that's had one ball python, now all of a sudden they're an expert. You have one person that, has a bearded dragon, now all of a sudden they're expert, or somebody that's bred on a few occasions and now they're an expert in something. Just the amount of ridiculousness that's out there of information is just overwhelming. But we're fine tuning here. So let's go back to something like a ball python. So take a ball python that's from Africa. They're a nocturnal species, so they do tend to hide a lot. Now, ball pythons are especially known for catching respiratory infections very, very easily. Why? Number one, too cold or too much moisture. Period. Now, I've had some folks, one of my staff breeds ball pythons, Adam. He breeds ball pythons, and he is the first to teach folks not to try and go bioactive unless you really know what you're doing. See, going bioactive for a ball python can be very difficult. For one, ball pythons are very, very prone to catching mites very easily. And mites absolutely will happen in too moist and too warm of an environment. It's gonna happen. Mites are gonna happen. But too much moisture can cause many different things. Mites, bacterial infections, fungal infections, respiratory infections, scale rot. There's so many things that can happen from too much moisture inside of a pen. So you have to be very careful about how you do that. Can you set a ball python up bioactive? Absolutely. You sure can. But you have to be very, very careful. You have to make sure there's an appropriate amount of airflow as well as pockets or areas of dry. Now, they go, well, they need 60 to 80% humidity. Right, in the wild. 60 to 80% humidity in something like this is going to be 90% stagnant, moist air that they're just constantly breathing in. Respiratory infection, let's talk about that. Respiratory infection is one of two things, sometimes both. It's like pneumonia, which is fluid in the lungs, and then it's bacteria like the common cold or the flu. So a snake, ball python, Burmese python, reticulated python, whatever, when they have a respiratory infection, they're going to have one of those two signs or maybe even both. Well, some of the old adage was, and I loved it. So, I mean, we are a teaching facility. And I had one vet many, many years ago. His thing was, if it has a respiratory infection, you up the humidity and you up the temperatures. Well, I know at the time I was just a country boy, but, a lot of us country folk do have actually common sense. And, we don't overthink things. But the first thing that I thought about is, okay, I could see upping the temperatures. You make it hotter, that's going to dry it out. Upping the humidity doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put more fluids in the lungs of something that's already drowning, as it were, in its own fluids. Ignorance. The stupidity never ceases to amaze me. So, too much humidity is absolutely a big cause of respiratory infections, also of mites. Now, this is more personal opinion. I'm not a big fan of foggers. I mean, foggers are great at a rave, but not so good in most systems for things like chameleons and other such animals that need more moisture. Foggers do eventually put moisture in there, but it's more of a misting fog, which works great. I mean, that's fine for frogs, but for things like chameleons and anoles and certain species of geckos, all that fogging that they're breathing in is just not healthy. I'm a bigger fan of misting systems. When it comes to misting systems, I mean, there's many different ones. And like I said, this is more misting versus fogging. It's more of a personal opinion, but foggers are a whole lot cheaper, typically speaking, than the misting system is. There's some misting systems that do get very, very expensive. But they work really well. And some of the misting systems will actually work on multiple cages at one time for folks that breed things like dart frogs and other such frogs and amphibians and salamanders, stuff like that. So there's a lot of goods that can come from an expensive misting system because you have one misting system that may actually run many, many, many different cages. But when it comes to the misting, we have to be very, very careful about how much fluid goes into a pen. So there's a lot of problems that tend to happen. Now, depending the species, of course, is going to depend on how much moisture you throw in there. Typically speaking, it's kind of like I use the example a lot of the times when people talk about bearded dragons. They want to treat them as if they come out absolutely stupid, not knowing what to do. No, they come out already hardwired knowing what to do. As long as they have a good water dish, a good sized water dish, and they have basic needs met, I mean, these animals do tend to do what they're supposed to do. I want you to think about it. Think about something like this right here. This right here, most people will keep their animal in this with nothing more than old paper towels and a simple water dish with a heating source. they survive, they do well. Now, I mean, good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, some people are going to have opinions on that they shouldn't be kept just like that, or that they could keep them even less, with even less stuff, and the animals do just fine. Yes, they will. So I'm not talking about the aesthetics of, what people feel is cruel when it comes to not having hiding items and climbing items, and it not looking like this versus, again, like this right here, where it's just an enclosure, a big enough enclosure, but there's very little when it comes to the way of housing items. That's neither here nor there for this particular conversation. The whole point is something like this is going to be very, very hard to maintain and regulate humidity without it either being too humidified or too dry. And as in some of the groups that I'm involved in that I do help out with, we see more problems than not when an animal is in something like this, and all of a sudden they have a bowel movement, then the thing is just humidified for hours and hours and hours on end. And it can cause, again, those scale rotting issues. It can cause mites. There's so many problems that can happen from things of that nature, and just the moisture that sits in there for way, way too long. So a lot of the questions of answering when we start talking about diving into this, how are you setting the animal up? Let's talk about that. Are you setting it up in a glass enclosure? Are you setting it up in a custom PVC enclosure like what you've seen before? Are you building your own enclosure? Are you doing something like a china cabinet, a curio, jewelry display case? I mean, there's so many different options and ways to set it up. Well, if it's going to be a tropical habitat, or at least a forested semi-tropical habitat, and there's going to be live plants in there, there's going to be moisture in there, then one of the things I suggest is, of course, putting something on that's going to move air. Maybe a mini fan, a computer fan, or having more open areas, more breathe holes and things for moisture and air to be able to escape, not just be retained stagnant in the same area or inside the same enclosure for extended periods of time, as these PVC cages will absolutely have happen. Rack systems is another one. I mean, again, it's all relative, technically speaking, when we start talking about humidity. Rack systems and PVC custom enclosures and things like that are absolutely going to retain moisture for far longer than other things will, because it's almost completely enclosed with very minimal breathe holes. So when we start talking about humidity, the question was, is humidity important? Absolutely, humidity is important. But it's also dangerous. It's also very dangerous. And so you you absolutely have to know the situation which you're getting into, and you have to take time to think about what you're creating for the animal and try and plan. Not everything can be pre-planned for, but try and plan for the best, most accurate, most beneficial habitat that you can create for your specific species.
So think of this. Humidity in something like these is going to be totally different than humidity in something like this. Okay, now real quick, let's talk about hygrometers or hygrometers. Your gauges that register humidity in your cage. Now, I want you to understand something. If I have a hygrometer way back there on the back wall, and it reads, 50, 60% humidity, that humidity may be totally different over here, okay? A lot of folks go off of these plastic round, they could be individual or they could be connected, they could be oval shaped, they could be whatever. They're analog, they are the biggest pieces of garbage from the pet stores that you could ever buy. Ever. The temperatures are never right, as much as 10 to 15 degrees off, and the hygrometer part is going to be off on percentages. Throw those pieces of crap in the trash can and stop buying that junk from the pet stores, okay? You need digital. Digital hygrometers work best. But if you're going to do a fixed one, you need to have multiples, at least one on both ends. Same thing for temperature. Now, we always recommend the only thing that we sell and the only thing that we use is a gun. Again, I'm not worried about humidity in these pens. Of course, we've been doing this long enough. We know when pens are a little too dry. We know when pens are honestly too wet. But if you're not sure about it and you want to be able to maintain, there is things that you can get. You can even get things like, if you'll watch one of our previous videos, we did a product review that was sent to us by Inkbird. It was an actual temperature hygrometer that you could watch from your phone. It was done through internet. So you could stick that Inkbird temp hygrometer gauge sitting right inside your pen, and you could see what the temperature is, what the humidity is at any point in time, okay? What's great about that is you can set an alarm. So if you have a misting system set up to go every couple of hours, okay, maybe for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, you got your misting system set up, throw a little bit of water throughout the pen for about 10, 15 seconds. Let's say that the temperatures drop too low, you can set an alarm on that specific unit and many other units, it's not just Inkbird, but on that specific unit to alarm your phone and let you know when the temperatures get too high, temperatures get too low, the moisture's too high, or the moisture's too low. So if you're not familiar or you're just not quite as versed with your habitat just yet, then it's absolutely crucial to, yes, have a thermometer, hygrometer combo or thermometer and hygrometer, but it doesn't need to be just in one spot. Because I've seen too many times where somebody will come into the storefront of the zoo, they go, man, my animal's not eating. Usually it's dragons, and they always have one of those piece of garbage plastic thermometers on the back wall, and it's on the back wall, and that's where it's at. Well, first off, it ain't telling you right temperature in the first place. Number two, you need to know temperatures from basking spot, hot in, cold in. You need to know multiple temperatures, but that thing is only going to tell you right where it's sitting. That's the great thing about a gun. Whatever that laser touches, it's telling you instantly what the temp is. Temps are far more crucial and important to us than humidity. But if you're not familiar with your humidity levels, you're not familiar with how much or too little moisture that you're using in your pen, then that's going to be absolutely crucial.
So again, also knowing where the animals come from. But understand, there's already humidity, and especially in our summers like here in the South. I mean, this year we've had excessive amounts of rain, and I mean you can just walk and feel the mugginess and the moisture in the air. It fills you up pretty quickly. So I mean, when we start talking, especially in the summertime, wintertime's a little bit different. Air does dry out in the wintertime, but in the summertime, you don't necessarily need a crap load of humidity for simple species that don't require crap loads of humidity. Ball pythons, Burmese pythons. Because I mean, think about it this way: if people are keeping these animals successfully in custom enclosures or in rack systems with minimal moisture or a water dish, and they do just fine, and they live for years and years and years, you don't need to throw a crap load of moisture into a pen. A lot of people go, oh, well, if they have bad sheds, if they don't shed in the whole piece, then it's unhealthy for them. All it means is the animal dried out. Snakes produce their own lubricant, okay? And when the air is drier, the lubrication that they produce between the layers just dries out a little faster, which means it's not as easy for them to come out, which is also why you'll see a lot of snakes soaking before a shed or soaking during a shed. Or if you want to help that out, soak the animal when they're in shed cycle once a day for about 15 minutes in warm water. And whenever they're ready to shed, it's going to come off of them very easily. So the foolishness around just the overdramatics of no humidity or too much humidity or no, or humidity in general is not necessary. But we have to look at not only where does the animal live, we have to recreate Mother Nature, but also you have to understand in enclosed spaces, it's hard to recreate everything about Mother Nature without us screwing something up. So personal opinion, and this is personal professional opinion of what we do, we always tend to err on the side of drier. Drier, I'm okay with. A little bit drier, I'm okay with. Too moist, it may start causing problems. And believe me, anybody that's ever dealt with a respiratory infection, it's a long-term process, takes a little time. Anybody that's ever dealt with mites, it's a long-term process, pain in the butt. It's not that big of a deal, but it's a pain in the butt, and mites can spread. So if you have more than one animal, you may end up causing problems for a lot more than just that single animal. So sometimes it is best to err on the side of caution. If you're going to go bioactive, paludarium, you need to know the species. You need to stick with the species that are usually best able to handle that kind of environment. Because, yes, have I seen people do, paludarium successfully for stuff like ball pythons and for things that not necessarily are always from that specific ecosystem as a grand whole. Some of them live on the borders of those ecosystems and do interact with it. Yes, but it's a lot more difficult. Now, Burmese pythons and retics, they're from the tropical rainforest. And we know this. But they're very prone, especially in captivity, albino Burmese pythons are very prone to respiratory infection. They already have a weaker lung because of the albinism gene. And so they're very, very prone to respiratory infection just from the least amount of anything going wrong. Even in the best of conditions, I've seen a respiratory infection kick into an albino Burmese. And mites, oh man, mites for boas and berms and retics are prevalent. They seem to be just super attracted to those animals. So the tiniest amount of off that you have when it comes to moisture in bedding, you could end up with a mite problem. Make sure to treat your beddings before you put it in there. Whatever your bedding is, your natural materials, it's okay to use real stuff, absolutely, because it's free. It's okay to use the real stuff, but make sure that you're treating it. And typically it's heat treating. Yes, you can do a bleaching treatment, but that takes 3 days. Heat treating, 200 degrees, 2 hours, and it's killed everything on there. So the best thing to do is to heat treat any of your natural stuff and clean any of your fake stuff like plastic, ceramic, whatever, whatever your other housing items are made out of. Just clean it. Soap and water. That typically does fine. And we'll talk about mites in another video. That's another one that I've been asked to do an in-depth video on, and the causes and different things that go on there. Too much moisture is a really, really, really bad thing. And most people just do not realize that too much moisture inside of an enclosed setting is totally different than outside in the outdoors where air does still move. Please bear that in mind. Okay? I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I did not dive deep into each species and how to set them up and stuff like that because there is multiple right ways to do it. There's a lot of wrong ways to do it, but there's multiple right ways, and I never try to get into a singular right and wrong. We try and give a broad overview. That way people kind of know how to proceed, and they can proceed the best way that they feel is best for their specific species. We appreciate you coming along. This is Chad. We are here again at the Kernersville Reptile Zoo Medical Center and Store. Make sure to write us in and let us know of other things you want us to film about. Our information will be in the description below for those that need to get in touch with us or those that have questions. You can also call us, as a lot of folks do. You can write us in. You can feel free to leave comments and ask questions that way. A lot of folks do that as well. So don't forget about the TikTok channel entitled Reptile Rangers, the Instagram page, which is Kernersville Reptile Zoo, and also the Facebook page, which is also the Kernersville Reptile Zoo. Again, not forgetting about, we do have, of course, the storefront. If anybody needs anything that is local to us or outside of state, we do ship stuff. If you're looking for pet supplies, things like that, that's fine. Feel free and let us know. We're happy to help you out. We appreciate you following along, and we'll either see you here at the zoo or we'll see you on the next episode. Later.